I want you to try a little thought experiment with me to start things off today.
Okay, I'm ready. Let's hear it.
So imagine you're living in a society with access to immense top-tier European wealth. You flip a switch, the lights come on, and you have, 100% electricity access.
Right.
You go to the doctor, you experience world-class health care, and the statistics say you can easily expect to live well into your 80s. It sounds like a utopia.
It sounds like the very definition of a highly developed, incredibly stable modern society. I mean, the kind of place people spend their whole lives trying to relocate to or at least retire in.
But here is where the thought experiment takes a massive counterintuitive turn. I want you to imagine that this exact same society, this wealthy, long-living, fully electrified place, produces absolutely zero food.
Zero. Not at all.
It imports every single drop of the energy it takes to run that pristine power grid. Its working-age population isn't growing. They're actually packing up and leaving at a staggering rate.
Oh,
And just to add a ticking clock to the whole scenario.
because it wasn't stressful enough already?
Exactly. Over a quarter of the land you are standing on is under direct threat of slipping entirely underwater.
It is a profound paradox. You are describing a society that has reached the absolute pinnacle of human development metrics, yet simultaneously balances on a knife edge of, well, existential fragility.
Right, and today we are not talking about a hypothetical sci-fi colony. We were talking about the French part of St. Martin.
Yeah.
And the source material we are diving into for this deep dive is a rigorous 15-page data insight report and slide deck built directly off of World Bank macroeconomic data.
Which is fascinating because, we need to approach this data by looking past the traditional marketing of a Caribbean island.
Oh, for sure.
If we strip away the tourism brochures and look at the raw macroeconomic truth, the reality of St. Martin is far more complex and, frankly, far more precarious than just a vacation destination.
And I think the actual design of this slide deck perfectly reflects that stark reality. Just to ground you as you're listening, the visual rules for this report are incredibly strict.
Very clinical.
Yeah, it's pure white backgrounds, the stark academic gray, and a deep sea blue. There are absolutely no 3D graphics anywhere, none of that corporate gradient stuff.
Right, it's all flat 2D charts.
Just flat 2D charts, and whenever there's a critical data point or trend we need to pay attention to, it's circled in these stark red dashed lines with simple geometric arrows pointing up or down.
It really forces you to just confront the numbers.
It does. And our mission today is to decode this place. We're going to trace St. Martin's transition from a booming microeconomy into a shrinking one. We'll explore its demographic inversion, its unbelievable trade dependency, its lock-in to fossil fuels, and its acute vulnerability to climate and internal pressures.
So let's start with the physical constraints, because everything else in this deep dive stems from the geography.
Yeah, let's look at slide 3. St. Martin, the French part, is officially classified as a high-income economy. Its official currency is the euro, but the total land area is exactly 50 square kilometers.
And that spatial limitation is the engine of the entire paradox. I mean, 50 square kilometers is a microscopic footprint for an entire, distinct, high-income macroeconomic system to operate within.
Right.
This is what economists refer to as a micro-island economy. But it isn't just small, it is hyper-dense in a very specific way.
Yeah, the urbanization rate, it's on slide 5, and it is 100%. When I first read that, I honestly thought it was a rounding error.
No, it is absolute. There is zero rural population. None.
Wow.
The population density data shows wild historical fluctuations, peaking at 749 people per square kilometer and currently sitting around 550. And when you look at the ecology on slide 11, the forest cover is surprisingly stable. It's about 12.4 square kilometers, which is roughly a quarter of the island.
But the agricultural land, the agricultural value-added data to the GDP.
It's a flat line. It is virtually non-existent.
Which brings me to the only analogy that made sense to me while reading this report.
Yeah.
St. Martin operates exactly like a luxury space station.
Okay, I think we need to unpack that comparison because it actually captures the mechanical reality perfectly.
Right. Think about the mechanics of a space station. If you live on one, your standard of living is incredibly high. You have top-tier technology, a strong currency backing you up. But the station itself generates zero internal life support when it comes to caloric survival.
There is no agricultural buffer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
100% urbanization means every single square inch of human space is dedicated to living, commerce, or services. Nothing is grown.
When an economy has absolutely no domestic agriculture, it means you have completely outsourced your physiological survival to external supply chains. I mean, if you are listening to this right now, look out your window.
Yeah.
Imagine if literally every physical object you can see, every apple in your kitchen, every piece of drywall, every drop of gasoline had to be loaded onto a ship, cross a vast ocean, and be unloaded at a port just so your society could function for one more day.
It's dizzying. It
Yeah.
completely changes how you view a simple trip to the grocery store.
In a macroeconomy, an agricultural sector, even a small one, acts as a critical shock absorber. If global shipping prices spike, or a major geopolitical event shuts down trade routes, a country with farms can at least feed itself, even if it's just basic staples.
But St. Martin doesn't have that shock absorber.
No, that 100% urbanization figure isn't just a quirky demographic fact, it is a profound structural vulnerability.
And the physical space they do have is fiercely contested. When you only have 50 square kilometers, and a quarter of it is protected forest.
Which is vital, by the way, for the local ecology and preventing soil erosion.
Right, absolutely vital. But it means the land available for human development is even smaller. You have tourism infrastructure, housing, roads, and municipal services all fighting for a handful of square kilometers.
The carrying capacity of the land is perpetually maxed out. This extreme density amplifies everyday municipal challenges. Think about waste management. It becomes an engineering marvel or a massive crisis. Where do you put the garbage of a high-income, high-consumption society when you literally have no empty land?
Yeah, or how do you manage freshwater resources? This absolute lack of a physical buffer sets the stage for the human element.
Which is where the data gets genuinely jarring.
So we have this 50 square kilometer space station that produces nothing internally. The immediate question is, who is actually running this station?
Wait.
And when you look at slide 4, the human capital, the foundation is cracking.
The demographic shift in St. Martin is nothing short of an earthquake.
The report traces an extreme inverted U curve in total population. If we go back to 1960, the population was incredibly low, just 4,250 people. Then it rockets upward, creating this massive mountain shape over the decades. It hits a peak of 37,450 people. It's circled right there in red on the chart.
But it didn't stabilize there.
No, it plummeted. There's a downward arrow showing the latest data plunging down to roughly 26,129 people.
The sheer velocity of that contraction is what stands out. To lose that significant of a percentage of your total population in such a short window of time is a massive macroeconomic shock. If you were standing in the main town square during that peak, you were surrounded by a bustling, expanding society.
Right.
Today, that same square feels fundamentally different because it isn't just that there are fewer people, the type of people has completely inverted.
The age demographic shifts are violent. On slide 6, they use a stacked area chart, and the data representing children aged 0 to 14 drops off a cliff, falling from 46.3% of the population down to just 21.3%.
A massive drop.
While the 65 and older demographic surges from a historical 4.0% all the way up to 10.4%.
It is a classic but hyper-accelerated aging crisis. Populations shrink rapidly for two reasons, and St. Martin is experiencing both simultaneously in a dual pincer movement.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, the society is fundamentally not replacing itself biologically. The crude birth rate crashed from 39.6 per thousand down to just 17.0.
Less than half.
Exactly. But the second pincer is outmigration, and they aren't just losing people uniformly across age groups. They are specifically losing their active labor pool.
Which brings us to slide 7. The report highlights a historical peak where the 15 to 64-year-old demographic made up 70.4% of the population. They put a red dashed box around it and call it the demographic dividend window. But now, that has fallen to 60.2%.
And that demographic dividend is a crucial concept to grasp. It's the golden era for any developing economy. It happens when you have a massive bulge of healthy working-age adults, relatively few dependent children, and relatively few dependent retirees.
The sweet spot.
Right. During that window, tax revenues soar, productivity peaks, and the social safety net is incredibly cheap to maintain because so few people are actually drawing from it.
But that window eventually closes.
And in St. Martin, it's slammed shut. When that ratio flips, when the labor force shrinks to 60.2% and the retiree population balloons, the economic burden becomes immense. You have fewer and fewer workers generating the tax revenue required to support the pensions and health care of more and more elderly citizens.
Here is where I need to push back on the data. or at least ask a question that seems completely contradictory. Usually when we see a shrinking, fleeing population, we assume we are looking at a rusted-out factory town or a nation experiencing a severe economic depression.
Right, that's the usual narrative.
But St. Martin is a high-income economy. It's
Right.
wealthy, it uses the euro. Why are the youth leaving a high-income Caribbean island? Are they just being priced out?
While being a high-income economy on paper often masks the structural reality of the labor market on the ground, in a microisland highly dependent on tourism, the overwhelming majority of available jobs are in the service and hospitality sectors.
Yeah.
You are looking at hotel management, culinary arts, retail, and transportation. These are vital jobs, obviously, but they often have a hard ceiling on upward mobility and wages.
Ah, I see. And if you grow up in St. Martin, you are an EU citizen with a French passport.
Precisely the point. If you are an ambitious 18-year-old who wants to be a mechanical engineer, an aerospace designer, or a corporate litigator, you are simply not going to find a deep, competitive job market for those specific skills in a 50-square-kilometer tourism hub.
Makes sense.
The rational economic choice is to migrate to mainland France or elsewhere in the European Union. So the island invests heavily in educating its youth and then loses them to the mainland, draining its own human capital.
They are effectively subsidizing the mainland's professional workforce. And while the youth leave, the people who stay are living incredibly long lives. Slide 8 shows overall life expectancy is exceptionally high, well over 80 years.
Very impressive for any nation.
But the data highlights a massive gender scissors gap. Females are living over 83.8 years, while males are at 76.7 years. That is a 7.1-year difference.
While women universally tend to outlive men slightly due to biological factors, a gap of over 7 years points to deep sociological divides. It often reflects occupational hazards historically borne by men, especially in construction and maritime industries, as well as differences in cardiovascular health management and behavioral risk factors over a lifetime.
But what does an island with an ever-growing population of octogenarian women mean for the macroeconomy?
It forces the entire design of the healthcare and social system to pivot drastically. You have to move funding away from pediatrics and maternity care because, remember, the birth rate has crashed and aggressively fund geriatrics, long-term assisted living, and chronic disease management.
All of which is incredibly capital intensive.
Exactly. Think about your own hometown for a second. What happens to the local baker, the mechanic, the overall tax base when the active labor force shrinks by 10% in just a few years and the elderly population doubles? Who is doing the physical work? Who is paying the municipal taxes to keep the roads paved?
It creates a hollowed-out economy. And that demographic hollowing makes the island even more desperately reliant on external forces. Which brings us to the macroeconomic vulnerabilities on slide 9.
The ultimate dependency.
If the space station analogy applied to the geography, this is where it locks into the economy. The report tracks trade dependency, specifically the trade-to-GDP ratio. And the line chart here looks like a heart monitor during a panic attack. The volatility is extreme, swinging violently between 110.9% and an astonishing 169.1%.
We really should pause on that metric.
I definitely need you to, because mathematically I am stuck on this 169% figure. How can a country trade more than its entire economy is worth? I mean, am I misunderstanding how GDP is calculated? It sounds like an accounting error.
It does sound impossible, but here's how the math actually works in a microeconomy. Trade to GDP is calculated by adding the total value of all your imports and all your exports, and then dividing that sum by your total gross domestic product. In large diversified economies like the US or mainland Europe, that number sits comfortably below 50 or 60% because most of what they consume is produced internally.
But St. Martin produces zero food and zero manufactured goods.
Correct. The domestic market is so tiny that almost everything consumed must be imported. At the same time, almost everything generated in terms of value, which in their case is tourism services, is considered an export.
Oh, I see.
So you have massive import values and massive export values sitting on top of a very tiny internal domestic value. When you divide that massive trade sum by the tiny domestic GDP, the ratio easily breaches 100%.
So the extreme swings in that percentage. What causes them to jump from 110% to 169%?
The lack of internal shock absorbers. Instead of comparing tourism to a tightrope, think of it as an agricultural monoculture. If a farmer plants thousands of acres of nothing but one specific type of banana, a single blight can wipe out their entire livelihood.
And St. Martin has a monoculture economy based on tourism.
Exactly. When you are this deeply integrated into the global supply chain with only one crop, every global hiccup hits you instantly and disproportionately.
A spike in global shipping container costs means St. Martin feels it immediately in the price of bread. Or a hurricane threatens the coast and cancels tourism bookings, and their exports plummet overnight.
It is pure macroeconomic vulnerability. They have no control over the levers that dictate their daily survival.
Which brings us to arguably the most vital import of all, energy. The data here on slide 10 is fascinating. Electricity access is 100% great, but the composition of that electricity.
It's heavily skewed.
There's a donut chart here. They use a magnifying glass graphic to show that non-hydro renewable energy makes up less than 2% of their total power generation.
Less than 2%.
On a sun-drenched, breezy island in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, the remaining 98+% is entirely fossil fuels, specifically imported oil. Why isn't an island that looks like a postcard blanketed in solar panels and wind turbines? Why are they still shipping in heavy oil for 100% of their power?
It is deeply counterintuitive, I agree. But to understand it, we have to look impartially at the engineering logistics and the capital constraints. It's easy from the outside to say, just build solar farms.
Yeah.
But remember the constraints we discussed earlier. St. Martin is only 50 square kilometers, and it is 100% urbanized.
Right, they don't have vast empty deserts in Nevada to roll out thousands of acres of solar arrays.
Exactly. Utility-scale solar and wind require significant contiguous land area, which is the one resource St. Martin absolutely does not have. The only spatial alternative is putting solar on every single rooftop.
Which sounds great in theory.
But that requires retrofitting an entire urban grid, which demands massive upfront capital that a shrinking tax base simply struggles to raise.
But even if they found the money, isn't there a technical hurdle with solar on a microgrid?
A massive one. Integrating highly variable renewable energy where the power drops the second a cloud passes over or the wind dies down into a tiny isolated island grid is technically incredibly difficult.
Because there's no backup.
Right. On a massive continental grid, if a solar farm in Spain gets cloudy, a nuclear plant in France can pick up the slack. St. Martin doesn't have neighbors to borrow power from. If the solar drops, the whole system blacks out, unless you have massive, incredibly expensive battery storage systems to stabilize the frequency.
So they're locked into a path dependence. The infrastructure to burn imported oil was built decades ago. It works reliably, and transitioning away from it requires space and capital they don't easily possess.
But this lock-in creates a massive economic hemorrhage. Every time the price of a barrel of crude oil spikes on the global market due to a conflict halfway across the world, money pours out of St. Martin's economy just to keep the air conditioning running. They are forced to export their wealth to import fossil fuels.
And ironically, burning those fossil fuels globally contributes to the very phenomenon that threatens to wipe the island's economic engine off the map entirely. The climate data on slide 12 is stark.
The sea level vulnerability.
Yeah. There's this red warning line drawn at the 5-meter elevation mark. 26.9% of the total land area and 22.67% of the population sit below that 5-meter line.
We need to translate what that 5-meter risk means in raw financial terms. When we talk about sea level rise, the popular imagination just pictures streets permanently underwater. But the economic devastation happens long before the water actually stays.
Wait, how does the economy break before the flooding becomes permanent?
It comes down to risk modeling and uninsurability. Long before an area is permanently submerged, a slightly higher sea level means it becomes far more prone to severe, repetitive flooding from seasonal storm surges.
Oh, like during hurricane season.
Right. Global reinsurance companies are looking at the exact same elevation data we are analyzing today. When over a quarter of your land is mathematically deemed high risk, insurance premiums skyrocket. Eventually, insurance companies simply refuse to underwrite policies for commercial real estate or homes in that zone.
And if you can't insure commercial property, you can't get a bank mortgage to build or repair it.
Precisely. The value of that prime coastal real estate collapses overnight. And in a monoculture tourism economy, where is all the high-value infrastructure located?
It's all right on the beach. It's the coastal resorts, the deep water ports, the marinas.
The core engine of their entire economy sits right in the crosshairs of that 5-meter risk zone. Defending that coastline with seawalls, elevating roads, and building resilient infrastructure requires astronomical levels of capital that, again, a shrinking labor force simply cannot generate through local taxes alone.
If you are listening to this and you live near a coast, apply this to your own life. Think about 26% of your hometown. Now imagine a red line drawn right through the middle of the commercial district. What would happen to your local economy, your property taxes, your school funding, if that entire zone was suddenly labeled uninsurable by global banks?
It would be devastating.
It's not a theoretical future problem. It's a present-day financial reality dictated by spreadsheets in London and New York.
And environmental risk is dangerously compounded by internal social fragility. Slide 13 shifts from the physical environment to the social environment, specifically tracking the intentional homicide rate.
Yes, the data shows extreme volatility here too. They use these dark gray, warning-colored bar charts. The rate fluctuates wildly, hitting peaks of up to 26.6 per 100,000 people, which is circled in red.
As analysts, we have to look at this data impartially to assess systemic risk. High macroeconomic income being part of the Eurozone does not automatically equate to social harmony or economic equality on the ground. A homicide rate peaking at 26.6 per 100,000 is significant.
To give the listener some context, many mainland European countries hover around 1 per 100,000. So 26.6 is a massive glaring anomaly for an EU territory. Why is there so much violence in a place with top-tier healthcare and wealth?
It often traces back to the concept of relative deprivation. You have a highly visible, incredibly wealthy, transient population, the tourists and yacht owners existing shoulder to shoulder with a local service sector workforce that is grappling with a high cost of imported goods, a shrinking labor pool, and limited upward mobility.
Ah, right.
That extreme proximity of immense wealth and localized economic frustration creates immense social friction.
And in a monoculture economy, that friction is an acute macroeconomic threat.
Absolutely. Tourism is a purely reputation-based industry. People choose their vacation destinations based on perceived safety and relaxation. If a microstate experiences a sustained crime wave and that reputation fractures on social media or travel advisories, the tourists simply choose another island.
And because they have no agriculture and no manufacturing, if the tourists stop coming, the entire economic engine stalls instantly. There's no backup generator for the economy. It's like walking a tightrope in a hurricane.
Right.
One bad storm or one bad crime wave, and the whole high-income structure wobbles.
Which brings us to the crucial question, how does a society survive this specific combination of pressures?
The report outlines 3 strategic pillars on slide 14 to stabilize the island: energy decarbonization, climate-adaptive infrastructure, and reversing the negative population growth.
If we evaluate the feasibility of these 3 pillars, they vary wildly in their likelihood of success.
Okay, which one do you see as the most achievable?
Strangely enough, energy decarbonization, yes, it requires upfront capital and complex microgrid upgrades, as we discussed, but the technology exists today and the economic incentive is massive. Every single solar panel or wind turbine installed directly reduces their daily vulnerability to global oil price shocks. It is, at its core, strictly an engineering and finance problem.
And the second pillar, climate-adaptive infrastructure.
Significantly harder, mostly because of the sheer scale of capital required. Building seawalls, elevating coastal roads, and redesigning ports costs billions. St. Martin cannot possibly fund this internally with a shrinking tax base. They will have to rely heavily on the Eurozone and mainland France to subsidize their physical survival.
Which becomes political.
Exactly, it becomes a geopolitical question. Will the mainland continue to pour massive capital into a 50-square-kilometer island just to keep the ocean at bay?
And the third pillar, reversing the demographic decline.
That is the hardest challenge of all. You cannot mandate population growth. You have to organically make a highly dense, isolated microisland appealing enough for young, highly educated professionals to want to stay or to return after getting their degrees in Europe.
You'd have to build an economy that offers more than just serving drinks to tourists. You need tech hubs, digital nomad incentives, creative industries.
Right. And you have to stabilize the social security system so the elderly are cared for without crushing the youth with taxes. And you have to ensure social safety by lowering that crime rate. It requires completely rewiring the society.
The report's final conclusion on slide 15 summarizes it perfectly. St. Martin is a highly prosperous but extremely vulnerable microsample. Being part of the Eurozone provides a massive financial shield. They have a stable currency and access to European capital.
But that financial shield cannot mask the physical reality of their geography. It cannot turn back the clock on an aging population, and it cannot magically update an outdated energy grid.
We have high longevity, but few births.
Right.
100% urbanized land, but zero agricultural independence. Immense paper wealth, but utter reliance on imported fossil fuels.
I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over. We have spent this entire deep dive looking at St. Martin as a unique, isolated microstate, but I want you to zoom out. Look at the macro trends we just explored. An aging population crushing a shrinking labor force. An absolute dependency on fragile global supply chains. A deep, stubborn lock-in to legacy fossil fuel infrastructure. And coastal real estate facing the slow, inevitable creep of sea level rise and uninsurability.
Wait, that sounds entirely familiar.
Exactly. If a territory backed by the vast wealth and stability of the Eurozone is facing this level of existential friction from these exact forces, isn't St. Martin actually a crystal ball? Isn't this exact mix of vulnerability slowly creeping up on the rest of the developed coastal world? Maybe St. Martin isn't an anomaly at all. Maybe it's just the first to arrive at the future.
That is a genuinely chilling thought. The space station isn't just floating in the Caribbean. We might all be living on it soon enough. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take a moment today to look at the macro data of your own community. Where does your food actually come from? How old is your workforce? How high above sea level is your commercial district? Look at your world with that same critical eye, and until next time, keep diving deep.